The disappearance of Heather Elvis in December 2013 did not begin with a scream, a struggle, or a visible moment of crisis. It began in silence. A young woman in her early 20s stopped responding, stopped arriving, and eventually ceased to exist within any traceable routine. In such cases, absence itself becomes unsettling evidence, forcing observers to ask what happens when someone vanishes without leaving even the smallest clue behind. This absence challenges logic, memory, and investigative expectation. Myrtle Beach, South Carolina appeared, at least on the surface, to be an unlikely setting for such a disappearance. It was a coastal community shaped by tourism, seasonal movement, and a population that maintained familiarity among its residents. Daily, life followed predictable rhythms, with work, home, and social routines repeating in steady patterns. In places like this, disruptions are uncommon, yet when they occur, they ripple quietly through the community and linger in collective awareness over time. Heather Elvis was a young woman in her early 20s working in the service industry, managing daily responsibilities while maintaining an active social life. She was described as approachable, energetic, and consistent in her routines, traits that allowed her to maintain connections with friends and coworkers. Like many at her stage of life, she was building stability while navigating personal relationships, balancing work demands with the evolving uncertainties of adulthood that quietly shaped direction and identity over time silently. Beneath that outward normalcy, Heather's personal life involved a relationship that existed outside the boundaries of exclusivity. This connection introduced secrecy, emotional negotiation, and subtle tension into her daily experience. Relationships of this kind often create internal conflict as individuals attempt to reconcile personal desires with practical realities. Over time, such dynamics can intensify, especially when communication becomes irregular and expectations between the parties are not fully aligned, creating conditions that gradually increase emotional strain and uncertainty, silently. Sidney Moorer became a central figure within Heather's personal narrative due to his existing marriage and his involvement in a relationship that operated outside public visibility. His connection with Heather existed in parallel to his family life, creating a divided structure that required discretion and careful management. From an analytical perspective, such dual roles often introduce instability as they depend on maintaining separation between overlapping emotional and social commitments, which can erode clarity and increase relational pressure over time gradually. Tammy Moorer represented the other side of this relational dynamic, as the spouse positioned outside the affair yet directly affected by its existence. The discovery of such a situation can provoke strong emotional responses, including anger, suspicion, and a desire to reassert control over a destabilized environment. These reactions are not uncommon in contexts where trust has been compromised, and they often influence how individuals interpret and respond to subsequent events, shaping perceptions in ways that persist emotionally. Myrtle Beach itself functioned as a close-knit yet complex environment where personal relationships frequently intersected with professional and social networks. Information often circulated indirectly through observation and conversation, making privacy difficult to maintain indefinitely. While the community appeared calm on the surface, underlying dynamics could influence how events unfolded and how individuals interpreted the behavior of others within their shared social space, often revealing hidden tensions beneath everyday interactions and routine appearances. Over time, they accumulate quietly further. In Heather's case, there were no immediate signs that alerted the broader community to a developing crisis. Her routine remained consistent, and her interactions appeared normal to those around her. This lack of visible disruption is often misleading, as absence of warning does not necessarily indicate absence of risk. For investigators, it limits early indicators that might otherwise help establish a clearer timeline of escalation, making reconstruction dependent on indirect signals and incomplete behavioral traces over time gradually. What makes Heather's situation particularly notable is the contrast between outward normalcy and underlying complexity. On the surface, her life appeared structured and stable, yet beneath that structure existed emotional variables that are often difficult to observe. Externally, This duality created a scenario in which multiple interpretations could coexist, each supported by partial evidence but none capable of fully explaining the outcome on its own, leaving analysts to rely on inference rather than direct confirmation. Over time, gradually, as days passed without contact, Heather's absence transitioned from a temporary uncertainty into a confirmed disruption. Communication attempts went unanswered, and the consistency of her daily routine was no longer observable. For those closest to her, this shift marked the moment when concern became urgency, as the pattern of behavior no longer aligned with expectations based on her established habits, highlighting how quickly normal patterns can signal underlying issues when continuity is broken in observable ways over time. Gradually, in disappearance investigations, such breaks in continuity often signal that a situation has moved beyond ordinary explanation. At that point, the absence of information becomes as important as the presence of evidence, requiring investigators to rely on indirect indicators and reconstructed timelines. The transition from assumption to analysis marks a shift in methodology, where each detail is evaluated not only for what it shows, but for what it may imply in context, requiring careful interpretation and layered reasoning. Ultimately, Elvis's disappearance shifted from a personal concern into a broader investigation defined by uncertainty and incomplete information. What began as a disruption in routine evolved into a complex case shaped by relationships, digital traces, and unanswered questions, leaving a fragmented narrative that continues to challenge understanding and resist final explanation over time. The final hours of Heather Elvis's life did not unfold as a single dramatic moment that could be easily isolated or reconstructed. Instead, they appear as fragmented interactions, partial movements, and incomplete records that together form an outline lacking a clear center. In many disappearance cases, this final window is essential for understanding intent and influence. Yet here, the available information reveals as much through its absences as through what was actually documented, with lingering uncertainty remaining unresolved. Heather was last seen moving between familiar locations during the late evening hours, navigating parts of her routine environment rather than unfamiliar or isolated areas. This suggests her actions were consistent with established patterns of movement and social activity. Those around her did not perceive immediate alarm, indicating nothing appeared unusually disruptive. Still, subtle deviations in routine can signal internal stress, external pressure, or shifting decisions that are not visible to observers at first glance in subtle ways. Communication records from that night indicate that Heather remained in contact with Sydney Moorer, and these exchanges carry significance not only in timing but also in emotional context. Their relationship was already complex, and late-night communication often reflects heightened emotional states or unresolved tension. From a behavioral perspective, such interactions can suggest instability within the dynamic, particularly when one party seeks continued contact while navigating uncertainty, conflict, or shifting expectations between them. These patterns are often subtly revealing. There are indications that Heather's plans during this period were not fixed, as changes in schedule, delays, or decisions to adjust intended movements often reflect hesitation or reassessment. Such shifts can occur when an individual responds to internal discomfort, external influence, or new information that alters decision-making. While these changes do not inherently signal danger, they may create circumstances in which a person becomes more exposed to unforeseen events or influences that shape outcomes unexpectedly over time. During the early morning hours of December 18, 2013, the investigation focuses on a narrow time frame in which Heather Elvis was believed to be near a bridge and nearby parking areas. These locations, while ordinary in isolation, gain significance due to their relation to her last confirmed position. Without continuous surveillance or consistent eyewitness accounts, reconstructing her exact movements becomes challenging, forcing investigators to rely on indirect signals, fragmented data, and partial reconstructions that cannot resolve the sequence. At this stage, the gap between confirmed presence and unknown whereabouts becomes factor of analysis. Investigators must consider how quickly a routine environment can transition into ambiguity when monitoring systems are limited or absent. The bridge and surrounding parking areas offer few constraints on movement, allowing multiple possible directions, and outcomes. Each potential path must be evaluated against incomplete data, creating a scenario in which certainty diminishes while speculation increases, and the timeline compresses into an investigative window. One of the most striking aspects of this time frame is the absence of a moment marking the disappearance. There is no clear visual record, no confirmed eyewitness account describing a decisive interaction, and no documented event that can be identified as the exact point at which Heather ceased to be traceable. Investigators rely on indirect evidence, such as communication logs, digital activity, and environmental data. Yet when these sources are incomplete, any reconstruction remains provisional rather than conclusive. The silence that followed her last known activity is equally significant. Her phone ceased producing meaningful signals, and her digital presence became inactive. In modern investigations, mobile devices often function as extensions of an individual's presence, recording location data, communication patterns, and timestamps. When that flow stops abruptly, it creates a discontinuity that demands explanation, as it contrasts sharply with expectations of ongoing connectivity and routine digital engagement in daily life. This gap raises immediate investigative concern seriously. As hours passed without contact, Heather's absence became increasingly apparent to those closest to her. Family members, initially assuming a delay or temporary unavailability, gradually recognized that her lack of communication did not match her typical behavior. Established patterns of consistency often serve as a baseline for recognizing anomalies, and when those patterns are disrupted without explanation, concern naturally escalates from uncertainty to urgency within a short period. This transition often marks the beginning of formal concern officially. Friends and colleagues reinforced the growing concern by confirming that Heather failed to appear at expected commitments. Her absence was not limited to a single missed interaction but extended across multiple points of contact, indicating a pattern rather than an isolated incident. At this stage, the absence became persistent and inconsistent with her established behavior, prompting those around her to move beyond informal concern toward the expectation that something more serious had occurred. Urgency replaced initial hesitation quickly. Reporting the situation to law enforcement marked the transition from personal concern to formal investigation. Once authorities were notified, the case became a matter requiring documentation, coordination, and structured inquiry. Search efforts were initiated in areas associated with Heather's last known movements, as well as locations identified through communication records. These efforts aimed to establish physical confirmation of her whereabouts, but the absence of immediate evidence significantly complicated progress. Investigators faced increasing challenges at this stage: overall complexity. Simultaneously, investigators examined individuals connected to Heather's recent interactions, with Sydney Moorer and Tammy Moorer identified as persons of interest due to their known relationship and involvement in her personal life. Early questioning revealed inconsistencies in statements and delays in cooperation. While such behavior does not automatically indicate wrongdoing, it encourages closer scrutiny, particularly when timelines, explanations, and supporting details do not align consistently across accounts. Such discrepancies often prompt deeper verification efforts by investigators over time carefully. Alibis provided during initial questioning were examined using location data, witness statements, and corroborating evidence. In several instances, these accounts contained gaps or lacked sufficient detail to fully account for the critical time frame. From an investigative standpoint, inconsistencies or omissions can be as significant as contradictions, as they may reflect uncertainty, memory, limitations, or incomplete disclosure rather than definitive evidence of intent. Careful comparison across statements helps reveal hidden inconsistencies when patterns are analyzed systematically by investigators closely. As the investigation progressed, technical evidence such as digital records, communication logs, and surveillance systems was reviewed to trace Heather's movements and interactions. However, the available data remained incomplete. Some records were missing, while others failed to provide usable insights. This lack of continuity introduced additional uncertainty into the timeline and limited the ability to confirm events with precision, leaving investigators with a fragmented set of clues rather than a cohesive sequence of verified actions. Resolution elusive overall. When a disappearance occurs without clear evidence, investigators must rebuild events from fragments of information. In Heather Elvis's case, authorities worked to construct a coherent timeline using scattered accounts, partial records, and locations linked to her last known movements. The initial stage was not about certainty, but about narrowing possibilities through verification, comparison, and elimination of inconsistent details drawn from multiple sources across the developing investigation process. This approach allowed investigators to organize fragmented data into a working narrative. Investigators then focused on areas where Heather was last observed, examining public spaces, roadways, and parking areas associated with her final movements. These environments were not unusual individually, yet they gained significance when considered together with her timeline. The objective was to identify subtle physical clues, environmental inconsistencies, or overlooked details that might indicate whether she left voluntarily, encountered interference, or experienced an unexpected interruption during otherwise routine activity patterns overall. Each observation contributed incremental context for analysis. Another essential element involved interviewing witnesses who may have seen Heather or interacted with her during relevant hours. Their recollections were used to assemble a sequence of events aligned with known timestamps and reported activities. However, memory is inherently imperfect, and variations in recollection required investigators to compare statements carefully. By identifying overlaps and contradictions, they attempted to determine which details were reliable and which required further confirmation through independent sources and additional evidence. Consistency strengthened credible portions identified. Despite these efforts, the early evidence remained fragmented and lacked a single unifying explanation. Investigators were confronted with multiple partial narratives that did not fully align, requiring careful evaluation before drawing conclusions. In missing person cases, such fragmentation is common, especially when physical evidence is limited. As a result, investigators avoided premature assumptions and continued collecting data, recognizing that additional information might later clarify contradictions or reveal patterns previously unnoticed during the initial review. Patience remained essential throughout. As the investigation progressed, the case expanded beyond local attention and entered public awareness through media coverage. News outlets reported on Heather's disappearance, presenting updates and requesting information from the community. Public interest increased rapidly due to the circumstances surrounding her case, particularly the absence of clear answers. This attention introduced additional perspectives as individuals outside the investigation began sharing interpretations, opinions, and speculative explanations across various platforms, contributing to a broader discussion. Public narratives multiplied beyond control. Social media quickly became a focal point for discussions surrounding the case, where users proposed theories ranging from abduction to voluntary disappearance. These discussions reflected the uncertainty inherent in the available evidence, as well as the human tendency to search for explanations even in the absence of complete information. While some interpretations were grounded in logic, others were based on speculation, demonstrating how public discourse can diversify perspectives while also introducing conflicting narratives that complicate understanding. Further ambiguity. Meanwhile, Heather's family faced the dual challenge of coping with uncertainty while also engaging with public attention. As advocates for information, they worked to keep the case visible, hoping that continued awareness would generate useful leads. At the same time, they encountered external commentary and interpretations beyond their control. This combination of private concern and public exposure created emotional strain as they balanced personal grief with the responsibility of participating in efforts to locate their missing loved one. As investigators continued analyzing the case, attention turned toward individuals connected to Heather's personal life, particularly those with whom she had recent interactions. Among them, Sydney Moorer and Tammy Moorer became subjects of interest due to their established relationship with Heather. Investigators did not assume conclusions at this stage, but rather examined available information to determine whether their involvement, statements, or behaviors could provide insight into the timeline, motives, or circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Focused scrutiny, guided inquiry. The existence of a prior relationship involving secrecy and emotional complexity introduced an additional dimension for investigators to consider. In situations where personal relationships intersect, with unresolved emotional dynamics, tensions can develop over time and potentially influence behavior. Investigators examined whether elements such as jealousy, control, or betrayal could have contributed to actions taken during the relevant time frame. While these factors do not prove involvement, they are relevant when evaluating context and possible motivations. Context shaped investigative interpretation. Statements provided by Sidney and Tammy Moore were carefully reviewed and compared against available records and witness accounts. While some aspects of their narratives aligned with established facts, other elements raised questions due to inconsistencies or lack of corroboration. Investigators noted that discrepancies in statements do not automatically indicate wrongdoing, but they do warrant further verification to determine whether differences arise from error, misunderstanding, or incomplete disclosure of relevant information. Careful cross-checking helped identify subtle inconsistencies present. Additionally, alibi verification became an important focus as investigators sought to confirm the whereabouts of key individuals during the critical time frame. This process involved examining digital location data, communication logs, and any available surveillance records. In some instances, the information provided did not fully account for the entire period under review, leaving gaps that required clarification. Such gaps became areas of interest because they represented portions of time that could not be independently confirmed with available evidence. Further review. Beyond statements and timelines, investigators also considered the broader context of Heather's recent interactions and relationships. As additional information emerged, patterns began to form that suggested ongoing communication dynamics rather than isolated exchanges. Certain details indicated elements of tension or imbalance within those interactions, which required careful interpretation. From a psychological perspective, relationships involving secrecy or unequal control can create unstable communication environments, potentially influencing how individuals respond under pressure or uncertainty. Such dynamics often complicate behavioral assessment. As technical evidence was examined, digital records such as phone data, location tracking, and communication logs became increasingly important in reconstructing events. These sources provided time-stamped information that could either support or contradict witness statements. However, the available data was incomplete, with certain records missing or inaccessible. This lack of continuity limited the ability to confirm movements with precision, leaving investigators with an evolving but still incomplete understanding of the sequence of events. Further analysis remained ongoing continuously. When a case reaches a point where evidence is fragmented and definitive answers remain out of reach, investigators and analysts turn toward theory. Theories are not conclusions, but interpretations that attempt to explain what is not fully visible. In the case of Heather Elvis, several explanations emerge from the known facts, each shaped by limited data and interpreted through different lenses. These theories coexist as attempts to make sense of silence. The first framework centers on interpersonal conflict. Theory A. Personal conflict and jealousy suggests that the relationship between Heather Elvis and Sidney Moore created a dynamic that carried inherent instability. Extramarital relationships often involve secrecy, divided loyalties, and emotional imbalance, all of which can intensify under pressure. When Tammy Moore became aware of the affair, the emotional impact may have introduced a secondary layer of tension that influenced subsequent interactions. From a behavioral perspective, jealousy is more than an emotion. It can shape perception, influence decisions, and intensify reactions to perceived threats. Individuals who feel betrayed may try to reassert control through confrontation, surveillance, or other interventions. This theory aligns with known relationship dynamics and documented conflict, giving it explanatory strength. However, its limitation is clear. Although a motive can be inferred, there is no publicly confirmed evidence directly connecting emotional responses to a specific outcome in Heather's disappearance case context. Theory B. Accidental event followed. By concealment presents a different perspective, one that removes intentional harm from the initial equation. In this scenario, Heather may have encountered an unforeseen accident during her final movements, particularly in an environment that includes travel, late-night activity, and limited supervision. If such an event occurred, individuals present at the time may have chosen to conceal the situation due to fear of legal consequences, reputational damage, or personal involvement. This theory explains the lack of clear physical evidence by suggesting the situation may not have been criminal at the outset but became complicated due to later actions. Concealment, whether deliberate or not, can disrupt timelines and remove chances for immediate clarification. Its strength is explaining missing or incomplete evidence without assuming intent. However, its weakness is the absence of supporting details confirming an initial accident, leaving the theory largely speculative without physical or testimonial confirmation to validate it. Theory C. Targeted action by a known individual introduces the possibility that Heather's disappearance resulted from deliberate actions carried out by someone within her social or relational network. In this framework, trust plays a central role. Individuals are often most vulnerable not to strangers but to those they already know, because familiarity reduces caution and lowers perceived risk. If Heather engaged with someone she believed to be familiar or non-threatening, that interaction could have occurred without resistance or alarm. This theory is consistent with the absence of clear signs of struggle or public disturbance. It also aligns with patterns observed in cases where victims disappear without immediate detection. However, a significant limitation exists in the lack of identified individuals who can be definitively placed within this category with sufficient evidence to support such a conclusion. Without a confirmed identity or direct linkage, the theory remains broad and unverified. When comparing these three theories, it becomes clear that each offers partial explanations while leaving critical questions unanswered. Theory A explains motive, but not execution. Theory B explains absence of evidence but lacks an initiating cause. Theory C accounts for subtlety but lacks a confirmed subject. Together, they demonstrate the difficulty of interpreting incomplete human data. The absence of a definitive conclusion does not eliminate truth, but highlights the limits of reconstruction from available information in complex contexts today. From a psychological standpoint, the case reveals recurring patterns observed in interpersonal conflict situations. Control within relationships often becomes central when individuals perceive threats to emotional stability or identity. In response, people may try to restore balance through monitoring, confrontation, withdrawal, or influence. When relationships overlap, these dynamics intensify, creating layered interactions where intentions, perceptions, and reactions interact in unpredictable and sometimes conflicting ways across evolving social contexts. Another important factor is cognitive dissonance among individuals whose actions or circumstances conflict with their self-perception. When facing situations that challenge identity or moral boundaries, internal tension may influence communication. This can appear as inconsistencies, selective disclosure, or avoidance during questioning. From an investigative perspective, such patterns require cautious interpretation, as they do not automatically indicate deception but may reflect discomfort, uncertainty, or efforts to reconcile conflicting internal states under pressure over time. For Heather Elvis, the profile aligns with individuals in missing person cases involving relational complexity. Socially connected individuals emotionally entangled in unstable relationships may face increased exposure to unpredictable circumstances. While this does not establish causation, it shows how environmental and relational factors intersect. These intersections can elevate vulnerability, particularly when boundaries are unclear, communication is inconsistent, or external pressures subtly influence decision-making processes across situations in meaningful and sometimes difficult-to-detect ways. From a philosophical perspective, the case raises questions about human behavior and the balance between reason and emotion. Western philosophical traditions often explore how emotional intensity can override rational judgment, particularly in situations involving conflict or attachment. When strong feelings such as jealousy or fear emerge, they may shape decisions in ways that contradict long-term interests. This tension highlights the difficulty individuals face when aligning immediate emotional responses with broader considerations of consequences and responsibility in complex social environments. Eastern traditions' causality, consequence, and interconnectedness of actions. Events are viewed not as isolated incidents but as part of a chain shaped by prior choices and interactions. In this view, the relationships involved in the case can be understood as a sequence of decisions contributing to outcomes that ultimately produced uncertainty. Each action carries implications that extend beyond the immediate moment, influencing future conditions in ways that may not be immediately visible or fully understood at the time. If you found this case intriguing, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories. Some crimes leave no screams, only unanswered questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for taking the time to listen to Criminal Mindcast and exploring this case with us.